All right, let's get started on our first video of the week. Well, I guess second if you count the traveling through week 2 video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the basics of evolution. We kind of need to talk about this first because it sort of sheds light on virtually everything we talk about in this class. Now, evolution is a subject that will come up in many classes in your future career in college, but I'm going to kind of present evolution with a botanical bias, if you will, at least for this video for our class. We're going to be talking about characters that are the result of natural selection. These are adaptations. You might have heard this word before, used it even. We want you to view the characters that you learn throughout this semester in light of evolution and how they might be adaptive and how they might be adaptations. And so, I mean, things like, leaves and roots, how are these adaptive as opposed to sort of learning their fine detailed bits of information that we will, of course, require you to know. Instead of just having those all separate and as random pieces of information, we want you to kind of bring it together, and evolution is what sort of does that. Thinking about these characters like roots as adaptations. Sort of what is their function, will help you better understand the form, and let's get started. Next slide. So the outcomes of this lecture kind of posed as questions here. What I mean with this is after studying the material in this lecture and using the associated resources, you'll be able to answer these following questions. First of all, what is the definition of evolution? In fact, the definition might even evolve throughout this very lecture. What are 3 conditions necessary for evolution to occur? Okay, we're going to talk about that for a while. Number 3, we're going to talk about for quite some time. What is the explanation for how each of these 3 conditions work and therefore results in evolution? So it's all about these conditions. And then lastly, we're going to just very briefly touch on what are the potential ramifications of accepting evolutionary theory as an explanation for all of life to as opposed to theistic explanations for all of life. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, here's just a list of some vocabulary that these are all terms that'll come up in the video. You don't need to focus your studies on these terms. Focus, especially your studies during this video, on those previous 4 questions that I just posed. These are just terms that will sort of help you communicate about this topic effectively with people. Let's move on. What is the definition of evolution? Basically, it's just change. Anything can evolve, including, video games have evolved, right? They're not living organisms. You might have evolved over time. You've changed. Namely, it's change over time. But we're talking about evolution in light of biological evolution, which is change over time in living organisms, of course. So, we're talking about changes. These can be morphological changes, which sort of are your outward appearances. These can be anatomical changes, so your inside tiny features. They can be reproductive traits, physiological traits. All these things evolve. Namely, they evolve in populations. Populations are what evolve, not individuals. More on that kind of throughout this lecture. Really, though, evolution is change at the population level. The idea of evolution even being real and existing was a paradigm shift for our species, for humans. Right? Before the idea of evolution was sort of was brought up, there was no doubt that, in people's minds that the living organisms that they knew, including themselves, sort of did not have any deeper history than, say, maybe a few thousand years or maybe a bit longer than that. But they did not believe that these organisms were the results of change over time, and that some might be connected. In fact, that all organisms are connected and related to one another. So that was a big paradigm shift. This was really hard for people to sort of understand, people to believe, of course. But once people started seeing fossils like this, there was just no doubt. So these two organisms, Lycopodium on the right and Lepidodendron on the left, these are actually very closely related organisms, except Lepidodendron on the left is extinct. We only know it in fossil form. Now, these were kind of tree-looking organisms, can be up to 30 feet tall. These were quite large organisms, and this, hopefully you can see my mouse, this is a fossilized structure of their spore-bearing structure, and it's virtually identical to the modern-day spore-bearing structures, and that's how they know that they're closely related. But these tall, kind of heavy-duty, woody types of plants, these don't exist in the modern-day Lycopodia. And so by learning about these, by discovering these fossils, we find out about a deep history of lots of organisms. And again, paradigm shift. Cool. Moving on. What are 3 conditions necessary for evolution to occur? Well, first of all, there has to be variability of characteristics among individuals in a population. If everything is all similar, then change over time would be impossible because there would be no differences. So variability is is a basic tenet of evolution. Next one is these characters must be heritable. In other words, they must be able to be passed on from generation to generation. And then there also must be something driving change in order for evolution to occur. There must be a mechanism of change. So, I need some water here. Going a little fast. So on the right-hand side of this slide, we have something that maybe you've seen before. This is called an evolutionary tree. It's also known as a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram. And what it represents is change over time in organisms and the pattern of relatedness. And it also represents there's also common ancestors represented on this cladogram and all cladograms. They are the sort of branching points that you see here. And the closer you are as an organism on a cladogram, sort of the closer you are to another organism's branching point, the more closely related you are. And so here are 2 pictures of these 2 species of diatoms. In theory, they're kind of closely related. Notice that time, maybe present time is right here. These are, let's say they're living organisms. A lot of these branches, they did not continue on. This represents extinct lineages, and this is what happens absolutely all of the time in evolution. Change in the environment might result in the extinction of some organisms, but other close relatives might live on. This happens quite a bit. So we've got these 3 conditions necessary for evolution to occur: variability of characteristics, heritability of characteristics, and a mechanism of change. Okay, let's move on. We got to cover just some real quick definitions. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but because we'll kind of get into this later in the semester. But just to understand evolution a little bit better, I have to talk about genes and alleles and mutations. A gene is a particular stretch of DNA, right? And DNA is this double helix that we see represented in this. All living organisms have this DNA, and a gene is a particular stretch of DNA. It codes for a protein, right? Proteins are produced by genes. The nature of a gene depends on the sequence of base pairs in that double helix. Namely, is it an A, a T, a C, or a G? I'll call them for short for now. You don't need to know these fine details of those terms by any means. So a particular sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's are a particular gene that codes for a particular character in a plant body, say a pigment of a petal, a red color pigment in a petal. Okay, so that's kind of a gene. Sometimes there's a mutation. Mutations happen absolutely all the time in DNA and all organisms. Sometimes they're totally neutral, nothing changes. Sometimes they're bad. Other times they're good. And anyway, when there is any sort of mutation, that results in a new version of a gene. And this is what we call a new allele, is when we have multiple versions of the exact same gene. We call these different alleles. And these new alleles arise from mutations. I just kind of threw that word out there. Mutations are really the ultimate source of producing genetic level variation. The variation that is produced from mutations is what spreads in a population. And so, okay, more on that as we go throughout here. Let's see, anything else here? Continuing with some definitions, I'll be using these throughout this lecture, throughout the semester, actually. Genotype and phenotype. Well, a genotype is a set of unique alleles in a single individual. For example, all humans have the same genes, but we don't all have the same alleles. We all have unique kind of combinations of alleles of the same genes, if that makes sense. And the same thing goes for plants and all other organisms. Genotypes are the underlying mixture of alleles, like I was just saying. But phenotype is sort of the expression of those alleles, the physical outward appearance, or or even like whatever is coded for by a genotype rather, is a phenotype. So, the physical expression of genes. Not only one phenotype can be produced from a single genotype. So this kind of that sounds crazy, right? There's just this one genotype. It's a combination of alleles. It's in other words, it's some individual's entire genome, all of their genes combined. Well, in two different environments, that genotype might be expressed two different ways. So, for example, if we have, like we have this example right here of a tree. Let's say it's a redwood tree. And we've got two different environments. The one environment is sort of higher elevation, if you will, sort of higher altitude, way up here in the canopy. And the other environment is way down here towards the forest floor. And we've got a very stark difference in the availability of sunlight. Right? At the top, there's going to be more sunlight available. At the bottom, there's going to be less sunlight available. So they're totally different environments that these branch tips are all growing in. And so even though this is one individual redwood tree, it's just got one, in theory, this kind of one genome. It's being those genes in its genotype are being expressed differently. At the very top of the tree, there are much smaller leaves. We call these kind of sun leaves at the tops of redwoods. And at the bottom of the tree, maybe where they sort of are, maybe they are in need of more light, the leaves are much broader. And notice the branchlets of needles are sort of bigger in this other environment, even though this is all one individual. Anyway, this is not evolution. This is just variation within a single individual. Different expressions of a genotype being expressed as literally as different phenotypes, which is the outward physical expression of a genotype. Okay, moving on here. Next slide. Definitions continued. Sexual reproduction. It turns out sex does not make new alleles. Sexual reproduction, it generates new combinations of existing alleles. And so new genotypes, potentially new phenotypes, new combinations of alleles. And so this will result in different proteins or slightly different looking morphologies in offspring. Each parent is a different genotype. The formation of gametes, which are eggs and sperm, by each parent usually results in gametes that have a different genotype than the parent that produced them. So in other words, the eggs and sperm are already different from their parents when they're created, when they're developing. when they're developed. They're already different from their parents. Crazy. The fusion of gametes from each parent results in a new individual. Fertilization is a fusion of gametes, and the fertilization event will result in a new individual with a genotype that is different than each parent. It is not the same as either parent. It is a completely different and, in theory, a unique combination of alleles. And that is one of the reasons why sex is so very special in biology. Oh, the next thing I want to talk about is something that's definitely a source of producing variability, which is why it's important to talk about. Definitely not always included in a discussion about evolution, though. And it's definitely good for what we are talking about in the scope of Botany 105. We are trying to have a really kind of big picture perspective of all botanical creatures. And so symbiosis, let's start with that definition. This is when two different organisms, like different species, different organisms are living together. They're literally touching each other in theory. That is what symbiosis means. Sym, that prefix means together, and bio means life. This is not necessarily a happy thing. This is not necessarily mutualistic. It could be parasitic, which or could be like a predator-prey interaction. But symbiosis is just things living together. And so in this example here, we have this photosynthetic cyanobacterium right here. Notice that base word bacterium there. This thing is green, hence that word photosynthetic. All right. And it sort of came from this lineage over here. In this very distant lineage, in theory, we have this different organism. This is an animal over here. This is a non-photosynthetic, eukaryotic, very small, single-celled animal predator. And this thing, it doesn't have photosynthetic material, and so it can't make its own food. It ingests food. It is a predator. And so it eats these cyanobacteria from time to time. Well, at some point, what might have happened, what happened was the cyanobacterium lived on inside of its predator. The prey here was not digested. Instead, it just persisted living inside of the animal that ate it. This, in theory, was the first plant. But it was more than just kind of living inside. What happened was genes were transferred from one organism to another. This is horizontal gene transfer. When you've got two different organisms, and there are genes being shared, and here in this case, this is the going theory for the first plant, and there is tons of evidence for this. The cyanobacterium and the host nucleus were sharing genes. This is horizontal gene transfer. It's not just living inside of the predator, it's passing its own genes over. That's how horizontal gene transfer kind of results in a unique set of genes. If this is the first plant individual right now, this nucleus, since this horizontal gene transfer has taken place, the DNA in this nucleus, the alleles in this nucleus are different from this parent animal, and they're also different from this original photosynthetic cyanobacterium. It's unique. It's a new genotype. Variation. Okay. And by the way, that word horizontal and horizontal gene transfer, it's talking about how this kind of happens within a generation, or it's talking about how it happens between different organisms, as opposed to normal gene transfer, which is vertical gene transfer. This is like, for example, sexual reproduction. How you've got genes going from one individual to another individual because they sexually produced that individual. That is kind of typical vertical gene transfer. The next slide here. Conditions. Moving on here to that third kind of question. Conditions for evolution. mechanisms producing variability. So we already talked about how mutations produce variability in organisms. Sexual reproduction, it's going to not produce new alleles, but it's going to shuffle those alleles around and produce new genotypes. That is also a source of variability. Horizontal gene transfer, just talked about that one. Another way that we can see variability, and we see this in plants, definitely not so much, not as much in animals at least. We see this a decent amount in plants, so it's worth bringing up very, very briefly. We could talk about this for a much longer time, but we're not going to. Polyploidy is when you've got more than 2 copies of each chromosome, and therefore each gene in a cell. The phenotype is potentially affected by the amount of protein produced. So let's say you normally are an individual that has 2 copies of your gene. So 2 alleles of that same gene. And we're not just talking about an individual like with this one gene. Imagine an entire individual's entire genome where all of the genes in that genome have 2 copies, right? 2 copies. Next generation, your offspring also has 2 copies of each gene. Well, say there was a mistake in sort of the molecular machinery involved in DNA replication or something like that. And it actually resulted in your offspring having 4 copies, twice as many copies of genes. This could potentially result in twice the protein content of a cell with only 2 copies. So it has kind of twice as much, twice as many proteins produced, potentially. So let's see. This is actually relatively well known. You might know about this happening. Polyploidy is common in horticulture and agriculture. So maybe you want like a really large variety of a fruit. This is sort of one way to do it. You can actually kind of mess with their genetics and induce this polyploidy condition to produce kind of maybe large flowers, larger fruits. Happens. Moving on here. Okay, so the gene is what is really important here. The gene is what's moving from generation to generation, and therefore it is the unit of heritability. And I wanted to introduce this kind of a new definition of evolution, a little more specific one now that we've been talking about some other terms. The change in the frequency of alleles of a gene over successive generations. This is sort of the same definition of evolution as earlier, but with more specific terms, essentially. So notice what's happening down here. We have change happening over successive generations, and notice it's sort of happening slowly. We don't have this kind of binary fashion of change happening where in one generation we've got all reds and the next generation every individual is blue. No. What's going on here are these dots are individuals, and in the first generation, one individual is blue while the others are red, and by the next generation, there's a higher proportion of blues to reds. And then in the third generation, there's yet again higher proportion of blues. Now here, in this example, we're using this example where the red is thin bark and the blue is thick bark, say in light of a Douglas fir. So imagine some gene that's coding for bark thickness. Maybe it's producing a protein that makes bark thick. Well, over time, apparently thick bark is beneficial to these organisms over time, because it is becoming more frequent in the population. So we can kind of hypothesize that it might be beneficial. So let's see what's going on sort of in the next slide. So yeah, now that we've been talking about variability quite a bit, now let's talk about what acts on variability. Let's talk about mechanisms of change. We're going to be obsessing over natural selection all semester long and on the next slide. But there are other ways that a population can change over time. There's another way that a population's allele frequencies can change over time. And this is genetic drift. Genetic drift is very similar to natural selection, except these are random changes in allele frequencies over time due to chance events. And natural selection, as we're going to be talking about, are non-random changes in allele frequencies. Okay. Sorry, I skipped over that first one. Mutations, they can also be considered here, as we've talked about. They can be a source of change, so I can't leave that out here. But to be specific about genetic drift here, these are kind of random chance events. Say you've got a situation like this where on the mainland, we've got a variation of these two alleles. We've got a big A and a little a allele. And there's a pretty, relatively equal proportion. It looks like someone has done the math here. You don't have to worry about exactly how they got this, but it looks like there are 61% of the alleles here are big A alleles, while 39% of these alleles are little a alleles. Well, say there was some new island that just appeared, a volcanic island or something, and there was a strong storm that picked up some seeds. And just a random sample of seeds were picked up by this storm and blown over to this brand new island. And now this new island, it just got a couple of seeds, and we can recalculate the new allele frequency of this tiny founder population. And notice that the wind happened to grab a bunch of little a alleles, or a bunch of individuals carrying little a alleles. And so now the frequencies have sort of flip-flopped after this founder event. Now the big A alleles are 33% of the alleles in this population, while the little a alleles are 67% of the alleles in this population. So imagine the individuals that are the progeny of this small founder population, there's going to be likely a higher proportion of little a alleles. Okay, another thing that could happen is a bottleneck effect. This might be when, for example, like in this picture, a meteor hits. This is sort of not a natural thing that the organisms in this environment are used to. These organisms might be perfectly well adapted to their environment, but if a meteor strikes, their bodies just might not have been ready for that, and they're going to be totally wiped out, except for, maybe a couple small individuals or ones who were able to survive this meteor for one reason or another. So bottleneck effect, it means a lot of organisms were sort of wiped out at once. Another example of this, it really just means a bunch of individuals were wiped out in a species. Another example of bottleneck effect would be overhunting, climate change, a big thunderstorm. I mean, a lot of things can really wipe out the majority of a species and leave only a few individuals. So that's the take-home message there. Okay, the next slide about evolution. Natural selection is another mechanism of change, right? This is that sort of third major thing we've been talking about here. Natural selection is non-random as opposed to genetic drift, and it has to do with the environment that organisms find themselves in. An environment is the selective agent here, and it's sort of selecting which individuals will survive and which individuals will die, right? So it's not random, right? It's the environment is not random. You might think of, if something is adapted to fire, well, fire is random. It's sort of moving across the like lightning struck in a random place, and then the fire expands more or less randomly. Well, yes, that is, but the outcome of fire is not random. The trees that experience that fire will die if the heat was extreme enough, right? Those Doug firs will die. So it's the environment that does the selection here. It's not the individuals, it's the environment. And here it was fire. It's just that individuals have one type of bark or another. They either have thin bark or they have thick bark. And so what these dotted lines here represent is kind of over time here, there are multiple fires that this population of Douglas firs experiences. Sort of think of these as an environmental sieve, right? So there's a big fire that comes through and it wipes out a bunch of individuals. Well, in the next generation, it turns out the ones who were able to get more individuals into the next generation were the ones with thicker bark. And maybe that's because the ones with thinner bark died. Probably is. So again, there's a fire later on and another environmental sieve. Some organisms will not survive this. Other organisms will. Those ones that do survive are going to be able to get offspring into the next generation. And therefore their alleles will increase in frequency over time. Specifically those alleles that allowed them to survive in this environmental change. Okay. Characters that are the result of natural selection that help an organism survive are called adaptations. And fitness is really the reproductive success of individuals of a particular genotype or phenotype that results in more individuals in the next generation. Okay. Fitness is the result of natural selection, right? If you're more fit in a high heat environment and a fire comes through, then you will have more babies, and that is what makes you more fit. And by babies, I just mean you're getting more offspring into the next generation, whether they're seeds or eggs, whatever they are. All right. Let's talk about some more examples of natural. Oh, sorry. Let me talk about this. And to kind of make that connection between the genotype and the phenotype and the environment here. The environment is the fire. That is what the organism is experiencing. Here, the phenotype is that thick bark, or you can think about the phenotype as the proteins that make the thick bark. Because those proteins are what are more directly connected to their genotype. Their genotype are the thick bark alleles here. And it's really those genotypes that are being selected for or against by that fire. Okay. And it's how the phenotype interacts with the environment that will kind of result in whether or not that genotype is fit in this environment. So here's some examples of natural selection that are super cool. Prunella vulgaris. This is a member of the mint family. You actually might see it around Humboldt if you're here, or actually in a lot of places in California. What happened is there's actually two different sort of forms of Prunella. There's a taller one, a taller stalked one, as you can see in this upper picture, and then there are these ones that produce flowers, these very squat flowers that are very low to the ground. What has happened over time is grazing has selected for these shorter stalked flowers. So where these flowers exist, where there is grazing by livestock, say cows or sheep or goats, it turns out that those flowers get picked off by the sheep or the goats. And that's what they really need to get their offspring into the next generation. And so if there happened to be some mutation that caused some organisms to have very short stalks, well, those ones would not get eaten by grazers. And therefore, that grazing environment has selected for these short-stalked flowers naturally. Another example would be here, this grass, this Agrostis tenuis. It normally grows in low metal content soil, and where there was some really high metal dumping grounds, actually some Agrostis evolved over time to be able to handle that really toxic high level of heavy metals. It can tolerate them better than the kind of parent population. Okay. A little bit of history here. The first ones to think of natural selection, we've got to talk about them. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin were actually coming up with the idea of natural selection at the same time. Now, the idea of evolution, change over time, had been around actually a little bit before them, but not evolution by natural selection. And in 1858, what happened was both Wallace and Darwin presented the idea of natural selection at a meeting. Darwin didn't really realize that Wallace had been coming up with this concept on his own, because Darwin, on the other hand, had been coming up with the idea of natural selection on his own, doing his own research for literally decades at this point. And once he realized that Wallace had the same idea, he was really pushed to finally put out his life work, which is The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. This is a very extensive review of natural selection. Wallace's was more so just an article, although they are both accounted for when you talk about the who sort of came up with the idea of natural selection. They sort of both did at the same time. Charles Darwin is the famous one because he had such an exhaustive book that came out, and this is the basis of evolution. Still, great book. Kind of heavy book, actually. So actually, people knew about change over time in organisms for a long time, actually. It turns out that the for millennia, farming has sort of been an example of evolution. It's just that it wasn't by natural selection, it was by artificial selection. Humans have selected for certain vegetative traits or sort of fruit traits that benefit our species. And so here, people are the selective agent, as opposed to a natural selection where the environment is the selective agent. And everyone's agreed, everyone's known about this artificial selection for a very long time. And it wasn't until Darwin and Wallace came out with the idea of natural selection that they thought, oh, maybe the environment is sort of causing a selection as well. Crazy to think about the fact that all of these plants that you see on this page, kale, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, cauliflower, these are all actually the exact same species, Brassica oleracea, and we as humans have just selected for different particular traits that we find attractive. So, crazy. Oh, another example of evolution by natural selection would be that of Darwin's favorite plants, Drosera, the sundew. These are carnivorous plants. They evolved from a sort of a regular plant, if you will, a non-carnivorous plant ancestor. And what happened was these plants that were sort of, imagine like a sort of normal looking plant because it's got green leaves that don't have these fancy hairs all over them, and maybe a stem or something. And they happen to find themselves on very poor soil, very low nutrients in this soil. And so if a mutation happens to pop up that results in their ability to get these nutrients another way, it will benefit them. Now, very few organisms are able to survive in this very poor soil. And so if they were able to get away, to kind of figure out a way to survive there, they could exploit that area since very few other plants were able to live there. And that's exactly what happened here in the sundew plant. And it has radiated to many very fancy looking species. What happened is they evolved a way to extract nutrients from animals. In other words, they are literally carnivorous. There are little digestive enzymes in the tips of these very sticky hairs, and an unfortunate fly will land on one of these hairs, but the plant will get its nutrients, the same sorts of nutrients that it was missing in the soil. It turns out that there are hundreds of species of carnivorous plants, and many of them, if not all of them, evolved from this similar environmental selective pressure of very poor soil. Okay. Some more water here. Here's a summary page. All right, let's explain what's going on here. On the far left, we have time represented. So think of this as a newer time, a more recent time. This is an older time down here. This is the common ancestor of all of these organisms. These numbers can represent anything. They can be families or maybe genus, genera, a genus level, taxa. Let's call them species. Let's say these are all different species. On the left side here, kind of, or at least labeled on the left here, we have mechanisms producing variability. And it's okay if, I know that these are kind of small and this is a detailed chart. What you just need to really get the idea of here is that we've got changes. We're able to sort of map these changes on this cladogram or this evolutionary tree. So these organisms, 1 and 4 and 18 and 11, they're all sort of different from one another because, some of them have, say, sexual reproduction represented by these green hash marks. Others have polyploid in their genomes. They have polyploidy conditions. And others don't have that. Now, what you have to know about these evolutionary trees is that when there's a change right here, all of the species beyond that change will inherit that change. And so all 11, 12, and 13, they all have this polyploid condition because that change occurred right there. Okay. And apparently also 9 does as well. There was also some horizontal gene transfer that happened here between species number 7 and species number 8. And notice 7 and 8 come from a very different lineage here. Very different lineages. But they came together from horizontal gene transfer, and notice 5 more species are the results of that original horizontal gene transfer event. On the right here, mechanisms of change acting on variability. So the left here, again, those were producing variability. That's sexual reproduction, being polyploid, horizontal gene transfer. The mechanisms of change that are acting on variability are natural selection and genetic drift. So things like those random events, founder effects, bottleneck effects. Those are represented by gray here. And these are just sort of random effects, random things that happened. Natural selection, it's constantly going to be sort of shaping the organisms that you find in an environment. Really, the environment is what's sort of shaping the diversity of organisms that you see in any given environment. Let me check my notes here, make sure I'm not forgetting anything important. My main point here on this slide is that it's really cool to think about all of this stuff happening at once, and that's exactly what evolution is. It's variation, it's change, it's selective forces, it's organisms in their environments, adaptations, evolving. It's happening all the time, all around us, and all of life on Earth is a product of this, according to evolutionary theory. And on that note, the very kind of last slide here, the last thing I wanted to briefly talk about, what are the potential ramifications of accepting evolutionary theory as an explanation for all life to theistic explanations of all of life? So in other words, what's sort of the difference what's going to be the difference in your life for accepting evolutionary theory as opposed to a creator as a theory, like or creationism as a theory? I kind of taught my preface here that I just kind of briefly talked about earlier how I would be talking about this later. Really, I want you to know that I expect you to understand all of this evolutionary material that I've just been talking about for the last little bit here. But you can do what you want with this material. It's up to you. I'm not trying to convert you. I'm just trying to make sure you are an informed individual about evolutionary theory. And since we're talking about botany for the next 14 weeks together, I at least needed you to sort of understand where we're coming from when we talk about adaptations, which we will be talking about all of the time. In my personal experience, evolutionary theory has had a profound impact on my life. Knowing that I am sort of connected to all other living organisms is a very grounding fact for me in my life. Evolutionary theory, it's not very well understood by many people, and I can't claim to understand it perfectly by any means. And it is indeed a source of consternation or anxiety. It's hard to accept that everything has a history and that things have changed over time. This can be hard to accept. And a creator is not needed to explain the diversity of life. This is another comment that can cause anxiety in some people. And so, you have to take this information and weigh it yourself. And each individual has the right to make decisions on what they do with this information. What we see today is due to a combination of random and non-random events and evolutionary mechanisms. Again, this is another source of consternation. Randomness is not very comfortable, especially when we're talking about origins of life. Right? That's not something that is sort of easy to grasp. Another thing that's true is that evolution is not goal-driven. It does not have a purpose to get better. And so this is also sort of hard to grasp. Because of this, humans are not more evolved than other life forms. I can't say that I'm better than a bacterium. I am not more evolved or fancier than a protist or a slime mold. Right? Because we've all made it to this point in time, haven't we? So we're all kind of equally fit for this environment, at least right here, right now. And the truth is that people, including scientists, are not all or nothing on theistic views of life. A lot of, I'd say maybe even most people out there have some, they have beliefs that lie somewhere in the middle of the spectrum here. I know plenty of scientists who are believers of God to some degree, and I know others that aren't. And there is a whole spectrum of people, and evolution may or may not, or the theory of evolution, this kind of knowledge, may or may not affect how you feel about that. Just wanted to say that. So that is the end of my presentation here. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.